I've spent more time discussing evolution online than what is likely the doctor's recommended dose. And in my many years of doing this, I've been asked more times than I can count if humans are done evolving or if we're a, quote, post-evolutionary species. And as a person who's really interested in the topic of evolution, I don't see this question as super coherent. Now, I don't mean for that to sound condescending at all. If you clicked on this video, it's because you're curious about the answer, and you're already doing better than most people. So many people think that evolution means things that it doesn't, while they think it doesn't mean things that it does. And this makes sense, right? Considering a study from last year found that teachers on average spend only about 12.4 hours discussing the most important concept in biology, and this is a 25% increase from only 13 years prior. I thought this video would be a useful introduction to evolution for people who unfortunately don't have much exposure to it. Now that I've sneakily lured you in with some clickbait, my plan for this video is to give a basic view of evolution and its common mechanisms, and hopefully by the end you'll have a comprehensive answer as to why this question doesn't make much sense. Though if you still have questions by the end, that's totally fine, and I respond to like every comment, so feel free to reach out. Before getting into what evolution is, I thought it might be useful to start with what it's not. In colloquial speech, the word evolution has become synonymized with the word change. This has led to many people equivocating the two, usually accidentally, though sometimes dishonestly. In science, evolution is explicitly a biological phenomenon unless the context is otherwise specified. And others take evolution to mean any biological change, including changes that occur in the middle of an organism's life cycle. This Pokemon style of evolution isn't really evolution at all, and the more proper term for this would be something along the lines of metamorphosis. The most accurate, modern definition of evolution is probably a change in allele frequencies over successive generations. Now, if you've discussed evolution online before, you've probably seen this definition. But it may also be a little complex for someone who's not super familiar with the relevant biological concepts, so I'll break it down into parts starting with generations, since it's probably the most obvious. The word generations implies that these changes occur over time and they aren't instantaneous across space. And 2, they have to get passed on from parent to offspring. Therefore, they must be heritable changes, and any change that doesn't get passed on isn't evolutionary. If I had some accident and lost an arm, that trait wouldn't get passed on to my kids, so it's not evolution. Lastly, an allele is the basic unit of inheritance within an evolutionary framework. It's the DNA sequence at a specific position in your genome. Therefore, the term allele frequency could also be probably substituted with genetic composition of a population. And putting it all back together, evolution occurs when the genetic composition of a population changes over time. Using that definition, an evolutionary process is any mechanism that can cause these allele frequencies to vary. Each mechanism is complex enough that it probably deserves its own video, but for the sake of time and the introductory nature of this video, I'll just do a super basic overview of the main ones. If evolution requires a change in allele frequencies, it kind of begs the question as to how alleles come into being in the first place. And the answer is mutation, which is one of the main evolutionary mechanisms. Mutations are essentially mistakes in the replication of DNA, and they create variation within populations. Over time, these differences build up, and then when lineages diverge, different mutations get fixed into different lineages. The genetic sequences that we have today are a snapshot in time between the genomes that have existed in the past and the genomes that will exist in the future. Even though we don't have all the genomes that ever existed, we can reconstruct these divergence events with an idea known as coalescence, or the idea that all alleles within a dataset come from a single ancestral allele. First, you align the sequences and compare at which sites they're different and what those specific differences are, and by using different modeling techniques, you can reconstruct the patterns of divergence. Here's some variable sites among the great apes that show how chimps are actually far more closely related to humans, despite superficially resembling gorillas more. As a field of study, reconstructing the relationships of organisms is known as phylogenetics, and if you find it interesting, feel free to subscribe, as I plan on having way more content breaking down those intricacies because it's what I study. Now that we have variation within our populations, it's up to the other evolutionary mechanisms to cause these allele frequencies to change. The oldest and most well-known of these processes is selection, as it was the primary idea postulated by Darwin and Wallace back in the 1800s. Selection is caused by differential reproductive success of different alleles. Once again, there may be some complexities here, but when you think about it, it's actually kind of intuitive. Once a population has selectable variation from mutations, certain alleles may provide some benefit to the organism. The organism with the most offspring will be represented by the most alleles in the next generation, while the organism with the least offspring will be represented by the fewest alleles. I usually divide selection into two main categories: the modes of selection that reduce variation in the population and those that maintain it. The diversity reducing category includes directional selection, disruptive selection, and stabilizing selection, while balancing selection represents the diversity maintaining category. The first one, directional selection, is probably what most people think of as evolution, but it's only a subcategory of one mechanism of evolution. Directional selection occurs when there's a push away from the mean of all phenotypes in a population and towards one of the extremes, usually due to a change in environment. Genetically, you can think of this as advantageous alleles going from a low frequency to a high frequency and replacing the alleles that the population previously had. The classic example, and perhaps the most famous example of evolution in general, is the case of the peppered moths, due to this discovery being made only a few years after Darwin's death. Peppered moths in the UK generally have a grey peppered coloration to blend in with the lichen and birch bark. The first black moth was discovered in 1811, but by 1895, they made up nearly 100% of the population. The Industrial Revolution had been pumping out soot and other pollutants, darkening trees. This nullified the lighter moths' camouflage and made them more likely to be eaten by predators. Later, when England's air quality improved again, the proportion of black moths began steadily decreasing, and now they've dropped to less than 10% of the population in most places. Second, we have disruptive selection, where the more extreme phenotypes result in a fitness advantage and the moderate phenotypes are selected against. This type of selection may result in speciation, though it doesn't always. Right now, there's an American species of fruit fly called the apple maggot, but the name is kinda misleading. These flies originally relied on hawthorn berries, as apples are a non-native species to the New World. Some of these flies have started specializing on apples while others stayed with the hawthorn berries, and despite interbreeding still being possible, these populations rarely do so in nature due to the fruits having different seasonalities. Third, we have stabilizing selection, which is kind of the opposite of disruptive selection. In this model, the more extreme phenotypes are selected against, so selection pushes in towards the middle. This is responsible for organisms usually going for long periods of time without changing much, as Stephen Jay Gould argued for in his punctuated equilibrium model. As organisms become well adapted to their environment, they generally don't change because they don't need to, until the environment changes as well, and then directional selection or disruptive selection takes over. Lastly, the main form of diversity-maintaining selection is known as balancing selection, where selection causes multiple alleles to be maintained in the population at the same time. A great example of this effect would be in cases where there's a heterozygote advantage. A commonly cited example would be sickle-cell anemia, which most of you are probably familiar with as a disease, so what benefit could it possibly have, right? Well, as it turns out, the full sickle cell disease only appears when you have two copies of the sickle cell allele, where one comes from each parent. Instead, if you only have one copy of the sickle cell allele, studies have shown that it actually provides some malarial resistance. So even though having this allele make up a large portion of the population would be harmful, having this allele present at a low frequency may be beneficial in regions where outbreaks of malaria are more common, which is exactly what the data shows. While mutations can have an effect on fitness and are subsequently subjected to selection, not all mutations have a fitness effect. Instead, they float around, varying to chance events. So this is another evolutionary mechanism known as genetic drift. Sometimes, organisms will have more offspring than another, or another may die before reaching reproductive age just by chance. Naturally, these chance events will have a greater effect on small populations. Let's say my backyard has a population of 10 squirrels and one gets hit by a car. The population just lost 10% of the potential alleles. If the population of squirrels is 100, that's only 1%. If the population of squirrels becomes 10,000, 100,000, or a more realistic number like a million in my backyard, the effect of drift is almost negligible, especially under shorter time frames. A specific type of drift comes in the form of bottlenecks. If some external factor causes a reduction in diversity, the remaining alleles will be the only ones to get passed on. This reduction could come in the form of a die-off, as well as the settlement of a new region in a process known as the founder effect. When a subset of a population settles a new region, they only take a subset of the alleles with them. For example, Tristan da Cunha is an extremely small, extremely remote island in the southern Atlantic. It was originally settled by a very small number of British colonists in the 1800s, and due to this, the allele frequency for retinitis pigmentosa is 10 times higher, because one of the founders likely carried this recessive allele. Over 40% of the population is asthmatic because 3 of the original founders also had asthma, and a greater proportion of the population is right-handed by a statistically significant margin. The last evolutionary mechanism that I'm going to talk about is gene flow, also known as migration. Naturally, the genes can't move around by themselves, so this requires organisms to physically go from one place to another. If 2 distinct populations have different gene pools but begin interbreeding, it introduces new alleles into the populations. It was recently a factor in creating a new population of Darwin's finch, which, interestingly enough, aren't actually finches at all and are a genus of tanagers. In 1981, an Espanola cactus finch somehow made its way to the island of Daphne Major. This bird, named Big Bird, successfully mated with 2 of the native finches. Its offspring produced a totally different song from the other native birds, so this lineage became reproductively isolated, arguably representing a speciation event. Gene flow, like the other mechanisms, doesn't necessarily have to result in speciation. I just think the cases where it does are generally more interesting. All this information together is why I think it's kind of funny when people say humans are done evolving. As long as humans have a system of inheritance with variation, we're subjected to the same evolutionary forces as everything else. If you have a mutation that wasn't present in your parents, that's evolution through mutation. If someone has a genetic condition that prevents them from reproducing, that's selection. If humans start a colony on Mars, there's a founder effect, and that's evolution through drift. And lastly, if humans occasionally travel back and forth from that Mars colony, you have migration. When planes fly, the upward acceleration is caused by the net sum of all forces acting on it. The plane is obviously still experiencing the downward force of gravity, but the other upward forces, like lift, are stronger in the short term. So sure, the apparent effect of evolutionary mechanisms are smaller today than they were in the past due to things like modern medicine, an extremely large population, and ease of travel. But saying humans have beat evolution is like saying a plane has beat gravity because it can fly. Alright everyone, that is the long-awaited video. Don't worry, I am alive. Just trying to get a video out for y'all has been a series of unfortunate events. I mean, it's already incredibly difficult to do just because I'm in school right now, and putting this on top of schoolwork is... it's very time-consuming. But I I finished like 2 or 3 other videos in the midterm, like in the intermediate time. And I just didn't like how they turned out, and, you know, one of them, it was something I cared a lot about, so I just decided to not upload those videos. And then there was a video I was working on for a while, and then I got COVID, and then as soon as I got out of quarantine, my laptop broke, so I lost all of the files, and that brings you up to now. But hopefully, I said this last time as well, I'll have more content going forward. I'm gonna try to do something maybe like once every month or 2. That's kind of my goal, but we'll see what happens. I mean, if you're subscribing, I guess you're in it for the long haul, so maybe every now and then you'll see a notification from me. Alright, well, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys later.